Welcome to Leafing Through Science, where we dive into the pages of popular books in the life sciences with the writers who made them happen, from new releases to timeless classics. I'm your host, Hedi Young, and this is part 2 of my conversation with neurologist Adam Zeman, author of The Shape of Things Unseen, A New Science of Imagination. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, we'd recommend starting there. In the first episode, we asked what imagination really is, exploring everything from childhood's imaginary companions to the amazing extent of our everyday mind-wandering. And we introduced aphantasia, the inability to form mental images, and hyperphantasia, its vivid opposite. This time, we look at how scientists have tried to measure imagination, from Francis Galton's 19th century breakfast table questionnaire to today's ingenious experiments that put the mind's eye under the microscope. You'll hear how simply imagining sunlight can make your pupils shrink, and how mental imagery can even bias what you see and smell, the very fragrance of thought itself. We explore how imagination can heal, like playing Tetris after trauma to curb intrusive images, and how it can misfire in the hallucinations of Parkinson's disease or bereavement, when the phantom spouse may still be seen or felt. Adam also shares the unforgettable story of Toby, a case that reveals the power of suggestion in functional neurological disorder. Finally, we see how thinking alone can train the body in musicians and athletes, and visit the extremes, from aphantasia to hyperphantasia, meeting people like Ed Catmull, former president of Pixar and Disney Animation, who prove that creativity doesn't depend on a mind's eye. So settle in as we continue to explore the shape of things unseen. Now, being able to measure mental imagery gives us a way to start understanding it. And one of the first people to actually try measuring imagination was Francis Galton back in the 1870s. He drew up a questionnaire about mental imagery, and could you tell us what he found?
Yeah, he was a great measurer. He said that he had a genetic disposition to both poetry and science, and kind of brought them together by measuring mental processes. And he devised a breakfast table questionnaire. So this invites you, it's very Victorian tool, it invites you to call to mind your breakfast table as you left it this morning, and then you rate the vividness of your imagery for the items on the breakfast table. And he found that there was a huge variability in the vividness with which people could recall this experience. And he actually noticed that, as he put it, there were some whose power of visualization was zero. He recognized that there were some people who seemed to be unable to visualize, whereas there were others who visualized very vividly. He noticed that scientists tended to be rather poor visualizers, though there were notable exceptions to this. His cousin was Charles Darwin, and Darwin reported very vivid, almost photographic imagery. So yes, he launched the measurement of subjective imagery vividness, and a range of questionnaires have picked up on that, on his method essentially. So David Marks created the Vividness of Visual Imagery questionnaire, which we've used extensively in our work, which invites you to call to mind a series of 16 images and then to rate them from as vivid as if I were really seeing it, score of 5 over 5, to no image at all, just thinking about it, which gives you a score of 1 over 5. And the scenarios are like watching the sun rising over the horizon into a hazy sky. And then others have created comparable scales extending right across the range of the senses. So there's the Plymouth Sensory Imagery Questionnaire, which taps not just into vision, but into the other senses, as in fact Galton did. So he focused on vision, but his scale took account of the other senses. The question of whether he was right about scientists has kind of echoed down the ages. So he thought scientists tend to be relatively poor visualizers. Women and children, he thought, were pretty good visualizers. There was a paper published last century suggesting that he was wrong about scientists. They aren't on average poor visualizers, but actually, interestingly, our work on aphantasia and hyperphantasia has added a footnote, because it does seem that aphantasia, if you're aphantasic, if you lack sensory imagery, that nudges you in the direction of working in STEM, whereas people with very vivid imagery, people with hyperphantasia, are a little more likely to work in traditionally creative areas. Though there are many exceptions to that rule on both sides.
And Galton's early work inspired many later questionnaires, as you've described. And you even include an adapted version of David Marx's test in the book, so readers can score themselves on the vividness of their own visual imagery. But scientists have also looked for more objective ways of measuring imagination, methods that don't just rely on people's self-reports. And one approach is to measure people's performance in tasks that require the use of imagery.
One criticism of work on imagery vividness, an obvious criticism, is that you just can't know. How can you know that your imagery is more or less vivid than someone else's? So there's a challenge here, a challenge to introspection, to the power of introspection. And I think that as a doctor, I'm rather well disposed to introspection, because actually as a doctor, people are constantly coming to tell you about their inner lives, and it turns out that what they tell you is very helpful in diagnosis. It gives you extremely useful clues. Psychologists have been more skeptical since the behaviorist movement in the last century. They've wondered whether introspective reports can be trusted. But certainly it's going to be helpful if you can kind of triangulate between introspective reports, behavioral evidence, so measurements of some aspect of behavior which might correlate with the introspective report, and then physiological measurements. And indeed, in the case of visual imagery, aphantasia and hyperphantasia, it has been proved possible to triangulate in that way. So, as an example of a behavioral measure, it is possible to assess the richness of people's recollection for their personal past, if you like, to measure the richness of their autobiographical memory. And it turns out that indeed people with aphantasia tend to have a relatively thin autobiographical memory. People with aphantasia tend to have a rather rich autobiographical memory. So that's a behavioral measure. Physiological measures, a couple of nice examples. So if you look into the sun, your pupils will constrict. If you look into a dark room, your pupils will dilate. If you have imagery and you imagine looking into the sun, your pupils will constrict. If you imagine looking into a dark room, your pupils will dilate. People with aphantasia don't show that pupillary response.
That's just an amazing. I mean, I thought that was an absolutely beautiful experiment. That was from the University of Oslo. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And called Ling. It's such a simple but beautiful observation, isn't it?
It built on earlier work, I think, showing that even illusions of brightness that don't have any actual increase in light can make the pupils constrict.
That's right.
Yeah. But it's incredible that, I mean, such a simple idea, really, just to get people to imagine something bright and then seeing that their pupils constrict. Incredible.
Yeah. No, amazing. And then another physiological measure, which turns out to be informative, is the galvanic skin response. So that's essentially a measure of sweating. If I were to tell you this story, you'd sweat a little. So you're lying in the sea, floating on your back, relaxing, the sun's shining, you're feeling very content. You can hear the murmur of conversation on the beach. And then the murmur quietens a little, and you just look up, and you see that the heads on the beach are all turned towards you. And you look round, and there's a fin advancing about 50 yards away. And then things go from bad to worse. Hearing that story makes most of us sweat a little. You can measure a change in galvanic skin response. People with aphantasia don't show this response. But they do show a response to scary pictures. So it's not that they can't generate the kind of gut response, it's that the verbal description doesn't do it for them. And the explanation, which I think is plausible often by the experimenters, is that you need to form an image to get the gut response. It's the image that mediates between the words, if you like, and the horror which most of us feel. So those are a couple of physiological examples. And then finally, you can go to the brain and see whether there are differences in brain activity between people who lack imagery and people who have very vivid imagery. And I think it may point the way to an explanation for aphantasia. When you do resting state studies in people who lack imagery or people with very vivid imagery, you find that there's an interesting difference in that in people with vivid imagery, areas at the front of the brain, if you like, the thinking brain, are more strongly connected with sensory areas at the back of the brain, in the visual brain, than they are in people with aphantasia. So there's a kind of constant dialogue, if you like, between thought and image, or thought and vision, in people with vivid imagery, which is not present in people with aphantasia. So it's becoming possible to interrelate people's first-person reports with aspects of their behavior and variations in their physiology and their brain activity in a way that I think is rather wonderful. It validates first-person report.
And so Imagination, which often strikes us as being something intangible, can actually be put under the microscope, and we have ways of measuring it. The questionnaires, but more objective ways of measuring imagination, such as measuring performance in tasks that require imagery. Another example you mentioned in your book are these classic cube rotation experiments where people have to rotate shapes in their mind's eye to see whether or not they're the same. And,
Yeah.
the more one is rotated, the longer it takes to decide, as if the mind is literally rotating the objects in virtual space to compare them.
Yes.
And then we've described this other approach to measuring the imagination, bodily involvement. This amazing pupil constriction experiment you described, a striking example of how imagination can trigger the same bodily responses as real perception. And amazingly, this effect isn't limited to vision. Imagination is multimodal, and it works for smells too. A team of researchers found that when people imagined a smell, they actually sniffed more, and the effect was stronger for pleasant smells than unpleasant ones. And when their noses were blocked, the imagined smells became less vivid, suggesting that sniffing plays an active role in olfactory imagery, just like eye movements do in visual imagery. An amazing section in your book on that.
That effect is particularly marked, isn't it, in people who are vivid olfactory imagers. It reminds us how different our inner worlds are, and that we should be cautious about universalizing from our own experience.
Absolutely. And then, of course, you mentioned the fMRI measurements of how people differ in their mental imagery abilities. And finally, maybe we can just describe the binocular rivalry experiments of Joel Pearson that you mentioned in the book.
Yeah, so this is a technique which Joel Pearson devised to measure what he calls imagery strength. If you present different images to the two eyes, it turns out that we don't tend to fuse them, we tend to alternate between one or the other. If you have a contact lens in one eye showing you a house and a contact lens in the other showing you a face, you won't see a kind of merged house face. You see house for a while and then face for a while, and your brain switches between the two in a way that you can't generally control. Joel discovered that if you get people to imagine one or the other before the images are presented, that biases the percept. So if you imagine face before you're shown house and face, then you're more likely to see face than you would be otherwise. And you can use the extent of that effect to measure imagery strength. It's generally lower in people with aphantasia than it is in those with imagery, and often absent.
A clever way of measuring mental imagery by looking at how what we visualize in the mind can interact with what we actually see.
There is indeed an interaction between those two things. Yeah.
And again, research suggests that this works for other sensory modalities too, such as for odors and the mind's nose, as you put it. Imagining the smell, for example, of a rose can impair our ability to detect the scent of tea.
Yes, you're kind of occupying the same region of brain with the task. So there's a potential conflict between imagination and perception.
Yeah, real estate competition.
Yeah.
And of course, imagination isn't always helpful. Sometimes it can be painfully powerful. You write about post-traumatic stress disorder, where people are haunted by images they can't escape, but also about ways imagination can heal, like reducing the power of these intrusive images through video games.
Yes, that's a very striking example, isn't it? So people with post-traumatic stress disorder will typically re-experience the traumatic event over subsequent weeks, months, and sometimes years. These re-experiences are involuntary, they're intense, they're very distressing. There's an interesting question about whether being aphantasic might protect you to some degree from PTSD, but that's another story. Emily Holmes, who's a very imaginative imagery researcher interested in the interactions between emotion and imagery, wondered whether it might be possible to reduce the risk of these intrusive images if you could occupy the visual brain after a traumatic event. The kind of background to this is that there are clearly processes of consolidation which lay memories down over time after we experience an event. So memories aren't acquired instantaneously. Changes have to occur in the brain over really quite a long period, certainly hours, to kind of entrench memories in the brain. And she conducted a rather sort of bizarre but wonderful experiment in which she asked people who'd come into A&E after a car crash, for example, if they would play Tetris for a couple of hours, rather than as they normally would, sit in the cubicle and just endlessly rehearse what had happened, which would give the brain the kind of optimal opportunity to entrench the memory. And it turns out that if you play Tetris, which is of course a visually engaging computer game, you are measurably less prone to intrusive imagery subsequently, probably because it would be the replay, the rehearsal within the visual brain that would consolidate the subsequently intrusive memory. And if you prevent that replay, you reduce the intrusions. And she's gone on to do really interesting work with people who have long-standing PTSD. So, for example, refugees who've escaped from traumatic events at home, wartime experiences, rape, and so forth. And she has leveraged another observation from the science of memory, which is that when you retrieve a memory, it becomes somewhat fragile, somewhat modifiable. What she asked these folk to do was to retrieve distressing memories. They were re-experiencing them. And then after retrieving them, they would play Tetris. And you might think that this was not likely to succeed, but in fact she has promising results suggesting that even in people with long-standing PTSD, it's possible to modify the memory in ways that might be helpful.
And again, differs from the computer analogy of the brain. A memory is not a fixed entity. It's a living thing which can change over time. And so using this approach then, by getting people to play Tetris, they can preemptively prevent intrusive flashbacks and retroactively reduce their power.
That's right.
And one of the most memorable stories in your book is about a patient you called Toby, a man whose mysterious movement disorder could be switched on and off almost like a trick. And could you share that story with us?
By way of background, it may be helpful to say that in neurology, we often, of course, encounter disorders which are explicable by what's happening in somebody's brain, which you can visualize on a brain scan. But very often, at least a third of the time, we encounter folk whose disorders are not straightforwardly explicable in this way, and where the underlying cause of the presentation, which looks as if it's physical disorder, turns out to be psychological. So this has come to be known as functional disorder in neurology. Controversial, but kind of useful term. But to tell you the story of Toby, so I was a youngish registrar, doctor in training at the National Hospital for Neurology long ago, and I was looking after a man with a puzzling disorder. His limbs would shoot out in front of him unpredictably and in a way that disabled and distressed him. I took the chief of neurology, Professor David Marsden, sadly no longer with us, to see him one day. David Marsden was a very kind of charismatic, brisk man. He introduced himself to Toby, and then he heard the story. I gave him a few lines of summary, and he said, well, in my experience, pressure on the left shoulder very reliably reproduces this disorder. And so he rubbed Toby's left shoulder, and obligingly Toby's limbs shot out and shook. Marsden said, and in my experience, pressure on the right shoulder very reliably relieves this disorder. And so he rubbed the right shoulder and the limbs dropped down. Rather than kind of accepting the challenge and explaining to Toby how it was that this could be, Professor Marsden said, Dr. Zeman will come back at the end of the day and explain things to you. So I was left with the quite difficult challenge of explaining how suggestion had worked so powerfully in Toby's case. But indeed, the power of suggestion was what David Marsden had employed. Suggestion is often at work in cases of this kind. This is a disorder which in the 19th century would have been called hysteria. As I mentioned, it's now known as functional disorder. People with functional disorder often have a belief about their symptoms which strongly influences and shapes their symptoms. So you may, for example, believe that you have had a stroke or that you have epilepsy or that you have multiple sclerosis, and what you know about those conditions influences the way you experience your body and the way it behaves. There's often an element of hyper-focused attention. So occasionally one encounters people whose disorder is really fully explained by attention. So it can be very counterproductive to pay attention to things that we do very efficiently, automatically, like walking. If you begin to pay very close attention to the sort of ingredients of gait, that can actually disable you. The way to help people in that situation is, in one way or another, to distract them, enable the automatic processes to re-engage and reassert themselves. And then often in the background, there is also an element of emotional disturbance. So a history of trauma, sometimes a history, for example, of sexual abuse, but not always, often a history of depression, anxiety, psychological distress. Hysteria, functional disorder it has quite a wide range of causes. Toby's case illustrates the power of suggestion. Professor Marsden was exporting a strong belief to Toby, which he bought into.
Yes, and I believe Toby later wrote to you to tell you that his problem had been cured by a series of shamanic trances.
That's right. He did. Which I think would certainly be consistent with a diagnosis of functional disorder. Another form of suggestion had operated powerfully on him.
And this is not new, as you say. It was called hysteria back in the 19th century. You mentioned that the London neurologist John Russell Reynolds wrote a remarkable paper about hysteria, and he described patients whose very real symptoms seemed to arise from ideas or imagination.
He described hysteria as illness according to idea.
Right, exactly. Yes, the region of illness is idea. He writes about one young woman who was terrified of becoming paralyzed like her father and gradually stopped walking and felt that her legs were becoming heavier by the day until she was eventually bedridden. Yet with reassurance, placebo treatments, physiotherapy, and encouragement, she made a full recovery in just 2 weeks.
The history of this subject is fascinating because I suspect that in the 19th century, it was easier to treat it because the very misleading dichotomy between disorders of mind and disorders of brain hadn't really come into existence. Functional disorder has been very difficult to deal with in recent times because in the course of the last century, psychiatry and neurology fell apart. If you had psychological reasons for a physical presentation, it was very difficult to deal with those because you didn't fit the prevailing map, which required people to fall into either a physical box or a psychological box. Glad to say that things are changing. Increasingly, these two disciplines are recognizing that they really need each other. Somebody described what happened in the 20th century as an era of mindless neurology and brainless psychiatry. and
Yes.
Happily, the two are coming together.
Well, I guess Freudian thought kind of hijacked the conversation for a while there back in the 20th century.
That's exactly right. Among other things, neurologists became increasingly captivated by the possibility of localizing functions within the brain. You can do that to some extent. You can localize vision rather precisely within the brain, motor control, but you can't localize autism or depression in any simple way. And psychiatrists became interested in psychological explanation disregarding the brain, led by Freud, as he said. The two disciplines moved in very different directions, but they had to ultimately reunite because mind and brain are very intimately related with one another.
Yes, well, I think we can be all glad that reunification has taken place. Continuing on the theme of how our imaginations can often overwhelm us. Most of us may be aware that the illness schizophrenia is associated with hallucinations, images and voices that seem to be external but come from within. But as you write, hallucinations can also appear in conditions like Parkinson's disease or even after damage to the brainstem.
In Parkinson's disease, they are very common, both in the more motoric form of Parkinson's, but also in dementia with Lewy bodies, which is a condition in which the initial symptoms are cognitive and features of Parkinson's develop later. The hallucinations of Parkinson's are reasonably characteristic, so they're often emotionally rather neutral, not always, but people often say that there are children who are playing in the bedroom or in the garden, or there may be animals who come and go. And there's often fluctuating insights, so people will sometimes recognize that these creatures are not real, but at other times they will interact with them. And there seems to be a combination of underlying causes, so changes in the sensory processing within the brain, which are degrading the information which is reaching the center, if you like, but also fluctuations in attention, because Parkinson's involves pathology deep down in the brain, which affects the systems that control attention. So a combination of degraded sensory information and alteration in attention seems to underlie these hallucinations. As you mentioned, pathology in the brainstem, there is indeed a fascinating condition called peduncular hallucinosis, in which a small stroke in the brainstem can release very, very florid hallucinations. So I remember going to see a man who'd had a small stroke of this kind on a hospital ward, who said that there was a seagull sitting at the foot of his bed, which he kind of half recognized was not real, but certainly looked as if it was there. And recently it's been shown that what happens in this condition is that inhibitory input to the visual system is suddenly released. So the kind of generative element of vision is liberated, and all kinds of visual experiences occur because they're no longer being damped down as they normally would be by the regions which have been affected by the stroke. So there's many neurological examples of causes of hallucination, but there are also more everyday causes like bereavement. I think a nice illustration of the working of the predictive brain. So if you lose somebody who's very close to you, you're very likely to sense their presence or see them or hear them or even feel their touch over the subsequent weeks, because your brain makes such a strong prediction that you'll be having experiences of that kind that occasionally the activity generated by that prediction kind of rises above the threshold that decides whether or not you will have an experience linked to the prediction.
It's another sign of the predictive brain, how our expectations, predictions can be so deeply ingrained that they linger even when the evidence says otherwise. Studies show that more than 80% of widows and widowers report some sense of their spouse's presence, hearing them, seeing them, or even feeling their touch. As you put it, it's a bit like a phantom limb, that strange sensation where people can still feel an amputated arm or leg, but instead it's a phantom spouse. When you've lived with someone for so long, they feel almost like part of your own body. And maybe it's no surprise that we call them our other half.
That's right. There are many examples of situations in which sensory deprivation leads to hallucination. So simply blindfolding someone often gives rise to visual hallucinations, simple or complex ones, after a few hours. And it turns out that blindfolding actually increases the endogenous activity of the visual brain. So if you lose input from the external world, your brain will work harder than usual to make sense of what is going on.
And yes, and there are other examples of how our imagination can overwhelm us. There's even a condition called maladaptive daydreaming, where people can get caught up in such intense daydreams that it interferes with their daily lives. But on the positive side, there are many examples you talk about where we can harness imagination for good. Simply imagining an action can help us get better at it in real life. Whether you're a musician or a surgeon, mental practice and rehearsing actions in our minds really does seem to improve performance.
I found the accounts given by surgeons were particularly interesting. It hadn't occurred to me that visualization would be an important part of a surgeon's life, but it turns out that many surgeons will visualize the day's operations ahead of time, and then they'll run over them in their mind's eye afterwards. And there is, in fact, some experimental evidence that if you encourage trainee surgeons to visualize procedures before they perform them, they will do so more efficiently than they would otherwise have done. Performers and sportsmen also describe the use of visualization, and again, there's experimental evidence that it is beneficial. Of course, I should say the sportsmen and musicians will often use not just visualization, but they will imagine playing their instrument, performing the actions required. There's some experimental evidence showing that novice pianists learning a simple series of finger movements show changes in the brain corresponding to their practice, expansions in the area of cortex involved in controlling those movements, which are actually very similar to those which occur if you really practice. Imagined movement has an effect not dissimilar to real movement in the brain. And there is evidence that imagined movement can also increase strength of movement. It doesn't increase muscle bulk, that probably requires real practice, but it increases strength probably by improving the efficiency of the system that's controlling the movement. So, yeah, both performers and sportsmen can benefit from mental practice.
I really loved that study you mentioned from the University of Iowa about how even imagining pushing your little finger against a resistance can make it stronger. Incredible. And I guess the reason we find results like that surprising is that we think that thinking somehow there's a kind of inherent assumption that there's no physical basis to it, where of course there is. Every time we're thinking a thought, there is an underlying physical substrate which is supporting it. And if you change your thoughts, you will change the physical substrate. And so we shouldn't really be that surprised that it can lead to a stronger little finger or better performance in playing a song or doing a sport.
Absolutely. So I think you're right. We're dualistic. We tend to assume that thought is in some way disembodied, but this is not the case. I quote Cahal, the founding father of neurology, saying that every man, if he wishes, can be the sculptor of his own brain. He was fascinated by synapses, the point of connections between neurons, which seems to be where the action is when we are shaping our brains. We have huge numbers of them, so 86,000 million neurons, and each of those has many thousand connections with other cells, synapses. Synapses are modifiable, they're plastic, and it's by changing the weights at synapses that we learn. We can bring about synaptic change through mental practice as well as through physical practice.
And of course, another positive effect of imagery is the ability to feel less pain with placebos. Pain relieving placebos also work off the imagination. And now I'd like to get to the cases of extreme imagination. I believe your first encounter with someone who had such a case of extreme imagination, or lack of it in this case, was back in the early 2000s, and a man called Jim Campbell.
That's right. I had referred to me a man who, as his GP had put it, had lost the ability to imagine, which I found a very intriguing symptom. I hadn't encountered this neurological symptom before ever. He proved to be a very delightful, articulate man in his mid-60s, a surveyor who'd previously had a very vivid visual imagery. He used to get himself to sleep by imagining faces of friends and loved ones, places he'd visited. If he read a novel, he would enter a visual world. He dreamt visually. If he lost his keys, he said he would be able to visualize where he'd put them. And suddenly all this had changed. He could no longer call anything to the mind's eye, no longer entered a visual world. He continued to dream, but he dreamt avisually. Couldn't see where he'd put his keys. He gave a very compelling account of a really pervasive change in his experience. We couldn't really fault him when we measured his cognitive abilities. As you would predict, he performed at floor on a measure of the vividness of visual imagery. He scored 16 over 80, saying he couldn't visualize any of the scenarios. He could just think about them. Interestingly, he could answer questions that you might think would depend on visual imagery accurately, like which is darker, the green of grass or the green of a pine tree. So most people will call to mind the shades of grass and pine tree and compare them. He said he just knew the answer, which seemed plausible. And we went on eventually to perform a brain imaging study in which we showed that when he looked at famous faces, his visual regions of his brain activated quite normally, but when he tried to imagine them, he failed to activate visual brain regions, which most of us, those of us with imagery, do activate. So there seemed to be a nice neural correlate for the change he described in his experience there. We wrote a paper about him, which I didn't expect to lead much further, but it was picked up by an American science journalist called Carl Zimmer, who wrote an article about Jim, MX, as we called him in the paper. And then over the next few years, people began to get in touch saying, I'm just like this guy, but I've always been this way. Nothing happened to me. Just as long as I can remember, I've been unable to visualize. People would often discover this, for example, during conversations with family or with friends, reminiscing about past events, and they would get the sense that other people were having a kind of visual or sensory experience which they lacked. So we sent these folk the vividness questionnaire, and they all scored very low, and we asked them a series of common sense questions, things like, how's your memory for past events? Do you dream visually? And so forth. And when it turned out that they were telling us a reasonably consistent picture, we thought we should describe them. But we needed a term for the phenomenon because there wasn't a kind of catchy, handy term for the absence of visual imagery. And so I consulted a classicist friend who suggested we borrow Aristotle's term for the mind's eye, phantasia, and tag an A on at the end. So that was how aphantasia was born in 2015. And at that stage, we had 21 participants. And since then, I've probably been contacted by getting on for 20,000, most with imagery at that extremely low end of the spectrum, but by some who I think are also very interesting with imagery so vivid that it's as if they were really perceiving. And we've called those folk hyperphantasic.
Is there any evidence that there may be genetic underpinnings to either aphantasia or hyperphantasia?
There is some suggestive evidence. So it seems that if you have extreme imagery at either end of the spectrum, your first-degree relatives are more likely to be in the same boat than if they were picked at random, probably about 10 times more likely. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's genetic. Galton thought that imagery vividness was genetically determined to some degree, and that's something we're now trying to explore in using a big biobank, so correlating people's imagery scores with their genome.
And I guess that's why the case of Jim Campbell, who you first encountered with this condition, is so interesting, because I think most of the cases we've discussed up till now have assumed that people have been like this since they were born, whereas Jim Campbell was not. I mean, he had a change during his life.
The great majority of people who've been in touch with us have lifelong aphantasia or hyperphantasia. It's always been that way so far as they can remember. But there are causes of acquired aphantasia, and sort of up until our work, there were about 100 or so cases in the neurological and psychiatric literature. So sometimes some straightforward event like a stroke or a head injury or an episode of meningitis can rob people of imagery. There's also a very interesting set of psychological causes. So it's associated with depersonalization disorder, sometimes with depression, occasionally with psychosis, possibly with past trauma. So it may be that sometimes trauma and the risk of traumatic memory will cause people to dial down their imagery vividness. So yes, there is a phenomenon of acquired aphantasia, but it's much less common than lifelong. I think it's got a lot to teach us, and that's something I hope to study more in future.
And it clearly had a big impact on Jim Campbell's life, as he movingly says, "I miss being able to see." I mean, for him, it was such a fundamental birthright. And to be deprived of it clearly had an emotional impact.
Yeah, it did have an emotional impact. He was a very grounded person, and it didn't devastate him, but he certainly missed it. The question of whether people with lifelong aphantasia would like to be given imagery is an interesting one. So one of the striking things about aphantasia, one of the most surprising things, is how undisabling it is. So people with lifelong aphantasia are usually just fine. There are some interesting associations, but it's not disabling. It doesn't prevent them from thinking or from recognizing things which you might at first imagine it would. And in fact, in 2019, we organised a conference for people with aphantasia and hyperphantasia, the first one of its kind. And we asked people with aphantasia whether they would like to be given the gift of imagery. And after a bit of discussion, the fairly clear consensus was that they would, but just for a day. They'd be interested to know what it was like, but they didn't feel they needed it.
We've already discussed the positives of imagery, but the lack of imagery can also have its positives. For example, maybe people with aphantasia find it more easy than most of us to recover from a breakup or a bereavement because they don't have those images in their minds.
So certainly, anecdotally, this seems to be the case. People with aphantasia are often described being somewhat more present than their friends and relations, and they find it easier, yes, to move on from a breakup, a house move, a change of job, a bereavement. And they may perhaps be less susceptible to some of the conditions which are associated with vivid imagery like PTSD.
Right, because people with hyperphantasia might be more prone to experience sadness about past losses, apprehension about future risks and dangers.
So I don't regard aphantasia as a disorder. I think it's an intriguing variation in human experience, and I think it has balanced advantages and disadvantages.
Right. I mean, people can lead very, very successful lives despite or because of it. I mean, you mentioned Ed Catmull, the head of Pixar, for example, wrote you a letter to describe his experience of aphantasia, but he's had a very creative life.
Very creative life, winner of the Turing Prize for his discoveries in computer animation.
Being deprived of that kind of imagery doesn't deprive you of creativity.
That's exactly right. Creativity and imagination in that productive sense is a much broader capacity than the capacity to visualize. I think if you can visualize, if you are a visualizer, you may well then employ imagery in your creative work, but it's not indispensable. And one of the nice surprises we had in our work, having assumed that people with aphantasia would probably not be so interested in the visual world, was to be contacted by really quite a large number of aphantasic artists. We actually mounted an exhibition of art by aphantasic and hyperphantasic artists, and I don't think you could have told from the products which group the artists belong to. Aphantasic artists often describe different ways of working, but they can love the visual world and they can reproduce it very successfully.
And some of the people who've written to you have written very eloquently about aphantasia. For example, someone didn't plug in the monitor or the speakers for me. Another person imagining a tree was like painting with jet black paint on a jet black canvas. And the writer Gemma Deer wrote of a landscape of speech and feeling on a moonless night. So yes, quite beautiful descriptions. And again, surprising to see just how common aphantasia and hyperphantasia are. I think it's something like around 4% of the population may have aphantasia and between 5 and 10% with hyperphantasia.
Yeah, it's a huge number of people. It's one of these invisible differences, I think, which has been neglected because each of us tends to take his own experience as the benchmark. It takes some doing to get people to appreciate that actually others in our lives may be very different to our own in some respects.
And what was your favorite part of writing the book? What was that journey like?
It was a long process. So I've had the ideas that underlie the book in the back of my mind for 20 years plus, and I got down to writing it properly in about 2018. As ever, one of the most pleasing things about writing a book is that it kind of forces you to knuckle down and get some reading done. I very much enjoyed reading around the subject more widely than I had before, and I was very lucky to be able to speak to really quite a large number of creative people. I interviewed some fascinating people, including Philip Pullman, the children's novelist, author of His Dark Materials, Sandy McCall-Smith, a very popular novelist who happens to be local in Edinburgh, and David Gray, who actually I heard playing a couple of nights ago. I hugely enjoyed those conversations. I also spoke to a range of scientists. So I think a combination of wide reading and some very stimulating, rewarding conversations. And I enjoy the process of writing. I'm always happiest when I have something on the go, which kind of occupies my mind when it's not otherwise engaged.
And finally, Adam, we always ask guests if they would like to recommend a book, fiction or non-fiction, to our listeners.
Yeah, so I had to think about this. Perhaps I can recommend one fiction and one non-fiction. I think these were both things which I might not have read had it not been for the book. And the first is Don Quixote, which I think some regard as the world's best novel, but I don't know how many people read it. And I enjoyed it surprisingly much. And I realised as I was reading it, and it was written when, in the 17th century, I realised that it's all about predictive processing. So Don Quixote's prediction is that everything that happens to him is going to somehow be connected with the chivalric code and the chivalric world. I thought in a way it's a very modern novel. And then non-fiction, I mean, there's so much to choose from. There are so many interesting books in this general area. But one I particularly enjoyed was by the Hungarian psychologist with an unwritable name. I think he's called Csikszentmihalyi. So he was a great psychologist of creativity. And he wrote a book which is called Creativity, which is a collection of interviews with creative people, which I found extremely readable, entertaining, and insightful. So I'd recommend those two.
Wonderful. So, Adam, thank you so much for taking us on this journey into the imagination. After reading your book, I think people will find that the imagination is even stranger than they could have imagined. So thank you so much, Adam. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us and see you next time.
Thanks very much for having me.